He goes on to say some other things. It is of considerable importance, Albright says, that in other contexts, when the disciplinary affairs of the community are discussed, the symbol of the keys is absent, since the sayings apply in these instances to a wider circle. The role of Peter as steward of the kingdom is further explained as being the exercise of administrative authority, as was the case of the Old Testament chamberlain who held the keys. Now what he means there is that nowhere else, when other apostles are exercising church authority, are the keys ever mentioned. In Matthew 18, the apostles get the power to bind and loose, but with absolutely no mention of the keys. That fits perfectly into this model, because in the king's cabinet, all the ministers can bind and loose, but the prime minister who holds the keys can bind what they've loosed or loose what they've bound. He has, in a sense, the final say. He has in himself the authority of the court of final appeal. And even Protestants can see this. In fact, I found this quotation in Martin Luther. From 1530, years after he left the church, "Why are you staring heavenward in search of my keys? Do you not understand," Jesus said, "I gave them to Peter. They're indeed the keys of heaven, but they're not found in heaven. For I left them on earth." This is Jesus talking. "Peter's mouth is my mouth. His tongue is my key case. His keys are my keys. They are an office." Luther even saw it. They are a power, a command given by God through Christ to all of Christendom for the retaining and remitting of the sins of men. The only thing that Luther won't admit is that there was succession after Peter died, which is exactly what the keys denote given their Old Testament background. One of the greatest Reformed biblical scholars of this century, Herman Ritterboss, a European scholar, in his Gospel, in his Matthew commentary says, this is going back, I should have read this a few minutes ago, but he says, "The slight difference between these two words, Petra and Petros, has no special importance. The most likely explanation for the change from Petros, Peter, masculine, to Petra is that Petra was the normal word for rock, because the feminine ending of this noun made it unsuitable as a man's name. However, Simon was not called Petra, but Petros. There is no good reason to think that Jesus switched from Petros to Petra to show that he was not speaking of the man Peter, but of his confession as the foundation of the church. The words on this rock, Petra, indeed refer to Peter. Because of the revelation that he had received and the confession that it motivated in him, Peter was appointed by Jesus to lay the foundation of the future church. One of the top evangelical non-Catholic scholars in America, Professor Donald Carson of Trinity Evangelical Divinity School, in his book God With Us, Themes from Matthew, says, Jesus was simply using a pun to say that Peter is the rock on which Jesus would build his church. Now, Dr. Carson is no Catholic apologist. He would try to set up arguments against the Catholic faith, I'm sure, but he's sincere, and I think also respectable as a scholar in insisting upon the obvious evidence and the conclusions. This has led an evangelical Protestant German scholar, Gerhard Meyer, who wrote a famous book that conservative Protestants frequently refer to, The End of the Historical Critical Method. In his article, The Church in the Gospel of Matthew, Gerhard Meyer says on pages 58 through 60, nowadays a broad consensus has emerged which, in accordance with the words of the text, applies the promise to Peter as a person. This is a Protestant speaking now. On this point, liberal and conservative theologians agree, and he names several Protestant theologians from the liberal to the conservative side. Matthew 16:18 ought not to be interpreted of a local church. The church in Matthew 16:18 is a universal entity, namely the people of God. There is an increasing consensus now that this verse concerning the power of the keys is talking about the authority to teach and to discipline, including even to absolve sins. Professor Gerhard Meyer is a Protestant with no interest in supporting the Catholic claim, but as an honest scholar admits that Peter's the one that Jesus is giving his power to. Peter is the rock, and the keys signify not only disciplinary power to teach, but even to absolve sins. With all due respect to the Protestant reformers, we must admit that the promise in Matthew 16:18 is directed to Peter and not to a Peter-like faith. As evangelical theologians especially, we ought to look at ourselves dispassionately and acknowledge that we often tend unjustifiably toward an individualistic conception of faith. To recognize the authenticity of Matthew 16:17 and following demands that we develop a biblically based ecclesiology or doctrine of the church. Gerhard Meyer is showing, as an honest scholar, that the church Jesus speaks of is a universal church, not just a local congregation. Another favorite ploy of anti-Catholic apologists. He's saying, no, the church he's talking about is the one holy Catholic church, the universal church. And the rock on which it will be built is Peter, not Peter's confession. And the keys that Jesus gives to Peter are keys not only to teach, but even to absolve sins. He's not saying we all should become Catholics. He's saying what we should honestly do is to grant the Catholics the point. Because if we're honest in interpreting the Bible, we have to admit these conclusions. Another Lutheran professor, a professor of Scripture and Theology at Concordia Seminary in Hong Kong, Tord Forberg, wrote an article entitled, Peter, High Priest of the New Covenant. Now, Forberg insists that Jesus is the ultimate high priest in the New Testament, but he says, quote, Peter is presented as some kind of successor to the high priest in tradition used by the final redactor of Matthew 16:13 through 19. Peter stands out as a kind of chief rabbi who binds and looses in the sense of declaring something to be forbidden or permitted. Peter is looked upon as a counterpart to the high priest. He is the highest representative for the people of God. This is Protestant testimony. And elsewhere I found in the Interpreter's Bible, quote, the keys of the kingdom would be committed to the chief steward in the royal household, and with them goes plenary authority, unlimited power, total. Post-apostolic Christianity is now beginning to ascribe to the apostles the prerogatives of Jesus. In other words, the person who wrote this section in the Interpreter's Bible is saying, I don't think personally that Jesus ever said these words. How could Jesus give to the apostles prerogatives that are his own? Well, the church has always held that Jesus said this. And what Jesus is giving is his own grace, his own power, and his own authority to his apostles. Now, Bultmann, one of the most notorious and well-known Protestant biblical scholars of the century, argues that it is impossible to regard Matthew 16 as an authentic saying of Jesus. He said, quote, how could he have envisioned the future development of an organized congregation of followers and appointed for them Peter as possessor of the power to teach and to discipline? I have several other quotations here. I won't go through them all, but let me just summarize with a quotation from an English scholar, Protestant, J.N.D. Kelly, in his book Oxford Dictionary of the Popes. He says, the papacy is the oldest of all Western institutions with an unbroken existence over almost 2,000 years. We are reaching a point these days in the scholarly dialogue that is exciting, where some of the most essential points are now being admitted and acknowledged gladly by both sides. But I must say, as I listen to tapes that are made of debates that are held across the country through the last few years, there are still many Protestants, or I should say non-Catholics out there, who are so vehemently opposed to the Catholic Church, they will still go back to the overreactions of the Protestants, the anti-Catholic misinterpretations, and use them. A good friend of mine was in a recent debate with a Protestant minister who was using them right and left. And even after the debates, my friend went up to him and said, do you think, even though you were arguing that Peter isn't the rock because you were quoting this and that and the other thing, do you think that Peter's the rock? And the anti-Catholic debater said, oh, of course I do. Although he'd argued against that position, he held it himself.